The Long Cold. Chapter 1. The thermometer outside the window of the Anchorage Relay Station read -61 degrees Fahrenheit, and Markus Voss did not trust it. He had not trusted a thermometer in 11 years, not since the cold had come down out of the north like a living thing, like some vast white wolf that had slept for 10,000 years and had now, at last, awakened hungry. He tapped the glass with one gloved knuckle, an old habit, a superstition really, as if the act of tapping might coax the mercury into telling a kind of lie. The needle did not move. It never moved. It simply sat there in its frozen trough, indifferent to him, indifferent to the dying station, indifferent to the great frozen hush that had swallowed the northern half of the world. He was 44 years old, though the cold had carved another 20 years into his face. The way frost carves patterns into glass, fine lines etched by wind and salt, and the particular grief of watching a world end slowly instead of all at once. Slow ends were the cruelest. A man could brace for a single blow, but the cold had not struck like a blow. It had arrived like a tide, inch by patient inch, and men had told themselves comfortable stories about its meaning until the comfortable stories froze solid in their mouths. It was the year 2050, and the sun, when it troubled to show itself above the gray shoulder of the world, was a small hard coin of light, more rumor than radiance. Voss was a relay engineer, which was a grand way of saying he kept 3 diesel generators from dying and a single radio mast from snapping under the weight of rime ice, so that the last 62 souls huddled in the heated core of the Anchorage station might hear, twice a day, a burst of static from the south that told them other people were still, technically, alive. The signal came from Seattle. Before that, it had come from San Francisco. Before that, Los Angeles. The cold moved south the way a man's blood moves toward his heart when his fingers are dying, abandoning the extremities first, concentrating what little warmth remained in some final citadel of life. Voss did not know where that citadel would finally be. He suspected nobody did. He suspected the men in Seattle were simply waiting, as he was waiting, for the world to tell them where to retreat to next, and that one day there would be no next place, and that would be that. He had a theory about the cold, born of long nights with nothing to do but think and watch the gauges. It was not a complicated theory, and it was not original to him. He had read enough of the old reports, back when there were still satellites overhead to feed data to men who still believed data could save them. But he had made it his own through long repetition, the way a sailor makes a superstition his own. The warming had done it. That was the joke of it, the savage practical joke at the bottom of all their suffering. 2 centuries of men burning the black blood of the earth, filling the sky with carbon until the world ran fevered, until the ice at the poles began to weep and slide into the sea. That, men had feared, was the death that awaited them. Fire, not ice. And they had not been wrong, not exactly. The warming had been real. The fever had been real. But fevers are not steady things. They are violent negotiations within a body, and the body of the earth had its own immune response, and that response had been the great cold currents of the Atlantic, the slow conveyor belt of water that carried warmth up from the equator and kept the north from freezing solid. That conveyor had stuttered and choked and stopped, gorged on the meltwater of Greenland, too thin and fresh now to sink and complete its eternal circuit. And so the very fire that men feared had reached up and, in a final irony only nature could devise, smothered itself, and what was left behind was not balance but a new and terrible cold. A cold born of warming. A cold that crept south 1 degree of latitude at a time while men in their dying cities argued about whether it was permanent, whether it was a correction, whether spring might come after all if they only waited 1 more year. Spring had not come. 11 years now, and spring had not come. Voss finished his inspection of Generator 3, found the fuel line beginning to crystallize where a seal had perished, and noted it in his log with the flat patience of a man who had stopped expecting anything to last. He had a wife once, in the years before, when there had still been a town called Fairbanks worth living in, and a daughter 6 years old, with a laugh that did not yet know enough to be afraid. He did not let himself think of them often. There was no profit in it. The cold had taken them in the second winter, in the panic and the failed evacuation south, in the great gray crush of vehicles frozen axle-deep on the Alaska highway, and Voss had walked the last 40 miles to Anchorage alone, hauling a sled with nothing on it but tools, because tools, he had reasoned with the icy clarity of grief, were the only things left in the world that might still be useful. He climbed the narrow stair to the relay room, where the others were gathered, as they gathered every evening at the hour the signal was due, drawn together not for warmth. The room was no warmer than any other, but for the simple animal comfort of not being alone when the static came. Chapter 2. The station held 62 people, though Voss thought of it, privately, as 62 flames in a wind, each one guarding its own small light against a darkness that wanted very much to put it out. There was old Henriksen, who had been a fisherman on boats out of Kodiak before the seas grew choked with ice that should never have formed so far south, and who now ran what passed for the station's kitchen, coaxing thin soups out of dwindling tins with the same patient skill he had once used to coax king crab out of cold water. There was Father Doyle, who was not really a priest. He had been a high school history teacher in Wasilla, but who had taken on the office because someone had to, because people needed somewhere to put their fear besides into each other's faces, and he did it now with a weariness that had become its own kind of grace. There was the woman named Itta, who was Inupiat, and who alone among them seemed unsurprised by what had happened, who had told Voss once, in the flat, unemotional way of a person stating a fact long known, that her grandmother had spoken of ice ages the way other grandmothers spoke of weather, as things that came and went on the breath of the world, and that the only mistake the southern people had made was believing the breath would always be warm because it had been warm in their short lives. And there was the boy Eli, 12 years old, the youngest soul left in the station, born the same year the cold began its long descent, and so knowing nothing else, no other world, no warmth in his memory at all, only this, the rationed fuel, the rationed food, the rationed hope. Voss came into the relay room and found them arranged in their customary half-circle around the receiver, a great brass and steel relic salvaged from a decommissioned Coast Guard cutter, its dials glowing faint amber in the dimness. Henriksen had a thermos of something that pretended to be coffee. Father Doyle held his hands near the small electric heater that the station's chief engineer, a sharp, tired woman named Reyes, rationed at exactly 40 minutes a day, no more, because the generators could not be pushed further without risking the failure that would kill them all far faster than any gradual freeze. "Anything from the south?" Voss asked, though he knew the broadcast was not due for another quarter-hour. "Nothing yet," said Reyes, not looking up from the receiver's dial, which she tended the way a mother tends a sick child. "There was talk on the auxiliary band an hour back. Couldn't raise more than fragments." "Fragments of what?" She looked at him then, and something in her face made the room go quieter than its usual quiet, which was already a profound and listening silence, the silence of people who had trained themselves to hear bad news arriving from a long way off, the way old sailors could feel a storm in their teeth before the sky had given any sign. "Fragments of Seattle going dark," she said. Nobody spoke for a moment. The wind found some new seam in the building's bones and made a sound like a held breath finally released, long and low and grieving. Eli, sitting near the heater with his knees drawn up to his chest, looked from face to face, reading them the way children read adults when the adults have forgotten, for a moment, to perform calm for the benefit of the young. "Dark how?" Voss said. He kept his voice level. He had learned, in 11 years, that the worst thing a man could do in a room like this was let his voice show the shape of his fear, because fear was a fire too, and it spread the same greedy way, leaping from one dry and frightened soul to the next until the whole room was ablaze with it and no good decision could be made in that blaze. "I don't know," Reyes said. "The signal cut. Might be the storm system moving down the coast. Might be the relay tower came down. We've lost 3 of our own this way, you'll recall, and Seattle's mast is older than ours. Might be. She did not finish the sentence and did not need to, because every person in the room could finish it for her. Privately, in the cold arithmetic each of them kept running at all hours behind their eyes. How many degrees, how many days, how many of the things that kept a fire burning could fail before the fire simply stopped? Father Doyle cleared his throat, the way he did before he was about to offer the kind of comfort that comforted no one but that custom demanded he offer anyway. We've lost signal before. 3 days, that time outside Portland went quiet, and then they came back. Henriksen finished for him, not unkindly. Aye, they did. But Portland's not Seattle, and 3 days isn't tonight. And I'll thank you, Father, not to promise the boy a sunrise you can't deliver. Eli's chin came up at that. He was not a boy who liked being spoken of as though he could not hear, and Voss felt a flicker of something like pride on the boy's behalf, the small fierce dignity of a child who has grown up too fast in a world too cold and has decided, somewhere along the way, that he would not be coddled out of the truth. I don't need a sunrise, Eli said. I need to know if we're next. It was the question none of the adults had let themselves ask aloud in some time, though Voss suspected every one of them carried it the way a man carries a stone in his boot. A small constant discomfort that became, in time, simply the shape of walking. Are we next? The cold had taken Murmansk and Reykjavik and Anchorage's own sister stations up the coast, had taken Fairbanks, had taken the whole vast frozen hush of the Canadian interior, and was reaching now, with the slow, inevitable patience of glaciers, down through the spine of the continent. The maps Reyes kept, old paper maps because the satellites that once updated them digitally had gone silent or fallen from orbit years before, showed a line creeping southward across them in red ink, a line that had once sat above the Arctic Circle and now brushed against the latitude of Seattle, of Chicago, of cities that Southern men had once believed, with the same comfortable arrogance that had doomed the conveyor belt in the first place, were simply too far south, too temperate, too civilized, to ever know what the people of Anchorage knew. We're not next tonight, Voss said, because it was true, and because true things, even small ones, were worth saying in a room full of people starving for the truth the way other rooms, in other ages, had starved for bread. Tonight we eat Henriksen's soup and we run generator 3 on a patched line until I can replace the seal tomorrow, and we listen for the signal, and if it doesn't come, we listen again tomorrow. That's the whole of it. That's all any of us have ever had. It was not eloquent. Voss was not an eloquent man. Eloquence required a kind of energy he had spent in some other life on things that no longer existed, arguments with his wife about money, lullabies for his daughter, the small grand performances of ordinary domestic love. He had none of that left to spend on speeches. But the room settled, somewhat, the way a fire settles when a log shifts and finds a steadier purchase on the coals beneath it, and Reyes returned her attention to the dial, and Henriksen poured the false coffee, and the long communal waiting resumed. Chapter 3. The signal did not come that night, nor the next, and on the third night Reyes told them, in the same flat voice she used for everything because flatness was the only voice that could carry such news without breaking, that Seattle was gone. Not gone in the sense of destroyed. There had been no fire, no catastrophe of the dramatic kind that the old world stories had trained men to expect when civilization ended. Gone in the quieter, more terrible sense. Gone the way a candle is gone when the wax runs out. Gone the way a held breath is gone when the lungs simply cannot hold it any longer. The cold had come down through the Cascades faster than the climate models. Models built by men who had never imagined a conveyor belt could stop so completely, so suddenly, on a geological clock that ran in human years instead of millennia, had predicted, and the city's grid, already strained past any reasonable margin, had failed in a night, and there had been no time, no fuel, no road south clear enough for the evacuation that might have saved them. It was Ida who said, into the silence that followed this news, the thing that needed saying and that none of the others, raised as they had been in a civilization that mistook hope for strength, could quite bring themselves to say, "We are not going to outrun it," she said. "Not by waiting. The cold does not negotiate, and it does not tire, and every year we stay in one place hoping it changes its mind is a year we could have spent moving." Moving where? This was Reyes, and there was an edge in it. Not unkindness, but the particular fatigue of an engineer who had spent 11 years solving the problem in front of her, and had learned to distrust grand gestures toward unsolved problems further away. There's no map that shows safe. There's only a map that shows where the cold hasn't reached yet, and that map redraws itself every season. South, it is said. Further south than we have let ourselves imagine. Not Seattle. Not California. Even California's grown too crowded with everyone who had the same idea we're having now, 11 years too late and panicked instead of planned. South past the equator. There were stations once, before the satellites died, that showed the warming hadn't reached everywhere evenly. Patagonia, New Zealand, Tasmania, places that were always cold by the old measure, that might be merely cold now instead of dead. Voss listened to this with the particular ache of a man being asked to imagine a future, which was a muscle he had let atrophy out of self-preservation. It was easier, he had found, to live entirely within the boundaries of the present cold, the present fuel line, the present soup, than to let his mind range out across the frozen miles toward some hypothetical southern haven that might, for all anyone in this room could prove, be exactly as doomed as Anchorage, only later. But he thought of Eli, sitting by the rationed heater with his knees drawn up, asking the only question that mattered. Are we next? And he thought that perhaps the boy deserved an answer better than we don't know, we'll see, we'll listen for the signal, that perhaps 11 years of waiting had taught Voss the wrong lesson, had taught him to mistake endurance for wisdom, when in truth the wolves of the old stories, the wolves his grandfather used to speak of in the long nights of a childhood that already, by the time Voss was born, belonged to a gentler world, those wolves had never survived a hard winter, by standing still in a clearing and hoping the snow would tire of falling. They survived by moving, by reading the land, by trusting their legs over their fear. How far? He said. If we tried it. How far and with what? Reyes looked at him as though he had betrayed some unspoken pact between them, the pact of two practical people who solved the problem in front of them and did not indulge in fantasies of elsewhere. But there was something else in her face too, something that might have been relief, the relief of a woman who had been carrying alone, for a long time, the suspicion that standing still was itself a kind of slow surrender, and who had wanted someone else to say it first so she would not have to be the one who broke the room's fragile equilibrium. But he thought of Eli, sitting by the rationed heater with his knees drawn up, asking the only question that mattered. Are we next? And he thought that perhaps the boy deserved an answer better than we don't know, we'll see, we'll listen for the signal, that perhaps 11 years of waiting had taught Voss the wrong lesson, had taught him to mistake endurance for wisdom, when in truth the wolves of the old stories, the wolves his grandfather used to speak of in the long nights of a childhood that already, by the time Voss was born, belonged to a gentler world, those wolves had never survived a hard winter, by standing still in a clearing and hoping the snow would tire of falling. They survived by moving, by reading the land, by trusting their legs over their fear. How far? He said. If we tried it. How far and with what? Reyes looked at him as though he had betrayed some unspoken pact between them, the pact of two practical people who solved the problem in front of them and did not indulge in fantasies of elsewhere. But there was something else in her face too, something that might have been relief, the relief of a woman who had been carrying alone, for a long time, the suspicion that standing still was itself a kind of slow surrender, and who had wanted someone else to say it first so she would not have to be the one who broke the room's fragile equilibrium. There's a vessel, she said slowly, at the old container port, icebreaker hold, built for the Arctic shipping lanes back when men still believed the melt would open them for good. She's been sitting there 4 years, mothballed, because nobody had fuel enough to take her anywhere and nowhere seemed worth going. She'd want an engine crew. She'd want provisioning we don't have. She'd want— Rhea stopped, and Voss watched her doing what he himself had been doing for 11 years, running the cold arithmetic, except now the arithmetic had a new variable in it, a direction, a south instead of only a here. She'd want a captain who believes she can make it, Henriksen said, and a crew willing to believe alongside him. That's the dearest fuel of all, lad. And the station's been running low on it, a sight longer than we've been running low on diesel. Chapter 4. What followed was not the stuff of the old adventure tales Voss had read as a boy, the tales of brave crews and clean heroic choices. It was, instead, 3 weeks of brutal, unglamorous labor, of stripping the relay station's remaining fuel reserves and arguing, sometimes bitterly, over how much could be spared for the ship without dooming whoever stayed behind. Of Henriksen and 2 younger men hauling tin stores down icy gangways with ropes lashed around their waists against the wind that wanted to throw them into the black harbor water. Of Reyes rebuilding a marine diesel engine with parts cannibalized from machinery that the station could no longer justify keeping whole, because a station with no future was, in the end, only spare parts for a future that might still exist somewhere else. Not everyone chose to go. This was its own kind of grief, quieter than the loss of Seattle but no less real. Father Doyle elected to stay. Someone has to keep faith with whoever still listens to this frequency, he said, and Voss understood it for what it was, a man choosing to be a lighthouse rather than a passenger, choosing to spend whatever years remained to him standing watch over a signal in case some other frozen soul, somewhere out in the white silence, was still listening for a human voice. A dozen others stayed with him, some too old for the voyage, some simply unwilling to trade a known cold for an unknown one. Voss did not judge them for it. He had spent 11 years learning that courage took more shapes than the old stories ever credited, and that staying could be its own fierce act of will, every bit as hard as leaving. 41 souls, in the end, walked the gangway onto the ship they had named, with the grim humor of people who had earned the right to a joke. The last argument, Reyes's name for her, offered one exhausted night over the engine housing, a reference to some old proverb about God and artillery that she half remembered from a grandfather long dead, repurposed now to mean something gentler and more desperate, that this voyage was the last argument any of them had left to make against the cold. The final plea entered into a court that did not care to hear it, but entered anyway because silence was a worse verdict still. They left in the gray hour that passed, in that latitude and season, for dawn. Voss stood at the rail beside Eli and watched the relay station's lights, dim, rationed, but lights nonetheless, recede into the white murk of the coast, and he found that his throat had closed in a way that 11 years of grief had not quite managed, because this leaving felt different from all the other leavings. The others had been forced upon him by the cold's indifferent advance. This one he had chosen with his own cold calculus, and a man who chooses to leave a place where people still live carries a weight that no conscript ever has to carry. "Will Father Doyle be all right?" Eli asked, and Voss heard in the boy's voice the same fierce dignity from the relay room, the refusal to be soothed with comfortable lies. "I don't know," Voss said. "I think he's decided that matching more than safe is worth the trade. I think that's a decision every person on this ship has made too, one way or another, just pointed in a different direction." The boy considered this with the gravity of a child raised entirely without illusions. "Which one did you make?" Voss looked out at the white water, where new ice, thin and treacherous, was already forming on the wave crests in long crystalline fingers that the ship's reinforced hull broke apart with a sound like distant thunder, over and over, mile after mile. "I made the one where I decided you get to find out what's south of here," he said. "That's the whole of my philosophy now, son. Everything else is just keeping the engines running long enough to make it true." Chapter 5. The voyage south was 8 weeks of a particular hell that Voss would, in later years, find himself unable to describe to anyone who had not lived through it. Not because the words did not exist, but because the words, when spoken aloud in warmer rooms, sounded like exaggeration, like the embellished suffering of old sailors' tales, when in fact every detail had been understated even in the living of it. The sea itself had changed character. Where charts and memory alike insisted on open water, the last argument found instead vast rafts of pack ice that should never have existed at those latitudes. Ice that had marched south alongside the cold the way refugees march alongside an advancing army, and Reyes, who had taken, by unspoken consensus, the role of captain, not because she had asked for it, but because she was the one among them least inclined to let despair make her decisions. Spent whole days at a time picking the ships. Careful way through leads in the ice no wider than the hull itself, while Voss stood double watches on the engine that had no business running as long and as hard as they asked it to, coaxing one more hour of life from bearings that screamed their exhaustion in a high metal voice. He learned to read the way a doctor reads a patient's labored breath. They lost 2 of the 41. An older man named Castellano, who had been a structural engineer in some long-gone life and who succumbed to a fever none of them had the medicine to fight, dying quietly in the 3rd week in a bunk surrounded by people too weary even for proper grief, who said what words they could over him and then committed him to the white water because the deck offered no ground to dig and the cold offered no time to wait. And a young woman named Priya, who went over the rail in a storm in the 5th week reaching for a line that had snapped free, and whom the black water took so fast and so completely that there was not even a body to mourn, only an absence at the next meal and a silence that lasted 3 full days before anyone could speak in the mess hall above a murmur. Voss, in the long hours of the engine watch, found himself thinking often of the wolf he had imagined back at the relay station, the great white wolf that had slept 10,000 years and had now woken hungry. He had meant it when he first thought it, as a kind of bitter metaphor, the private poetry a tired man allows himself in the small hours. But somewhere in the 5th week, watching the pack ice grind against the hull with a sound like the grinding of vast teeth, he came to feel the metaphor had curdled into something closer to literal truth. The cold was not merely an absence of heat. It had a character, a patience, a hunger that did not rage the way fire rages but simply, relentlessly pursued. And a man could outrun fire if his legs were strong enough, but a man could not outrun something that did not need to chase him at all, that needed only to wait, certain in the knowledge that warmth was a fragile and temporary condition and that stillness, cold's native country, was the truer and more permanent state of all things. It would have been easy, in those weeks, to surrender to that hunger's patient logic. Voss watched it happen to a few of the others in small ways. A stillness that crept into their eyes, a slowing of speech, the particular quiet of people who had begun negotiating, in some unspoken interior chamber, with the idea of simply stopping. He recognized it because he had felt its undertow himself in the 2nd winter, in the long walk to Anchorage with a sled of tools and a grief too large to carry and walk with at the same time. He had learned, that winter, the only weapon he knew of against that undertow, which was not hope exactly. Hope had proven too brittle a tool for 11 years of this, but motion. Simple, dogged, unglamorous motion. The decision, renewed each morning like a vow, to do the next necessary thing, and then the thing after that, and to let the philosophy take care of itself in whatever years might remain to examine it. He taught this, in his clumsy way, to Eli, who had taken to shadowing him on the engine watches with the single-minded attention of a boy who had decided, the way children sometimes do with a clarity adults have lost, that surviving was a craft to be learned and not a grace to be hoped for. The trick of it, Voss told him one watch, hands deep in the housing of a fuel pump that had begun, ominously, to knock, isn't believing we'll make it. I don't know if we'll make it. I don't know what's south any better than you do, and anyone who tells you they do is selling you something. The trick is just this, the pump. Right now, this pump and making it run one more hour. Tomorrow there'll be another pump, or another problem wearing the pump's clothes. You don't have to solve the whole ocean, son. You only ever have to solve what's in front of you. That sounds like giving up on the big picture, Eli said, with the blunt skepticism that had made Voss like him from the first night in the relay room. It's the opposite, Voss said. Giving up is what happens when a man tries to hold the whole ocean in his two hands and finds, rightly, that he can't and despairs of it, and lets go of everything because he can't hold everything. I'm not asking you to hold the ocean. I'm asking you to hold the pump. He did not know, saying it, whether it was wisdom or merely the only comfort available to a tired man with nothing else to offer a frightened boy. But he saw something settle in Eli's face, the same settling he had felt in himself dimly 11 years before, when he had stopped trying to mourn the whole frozen world at once and had instead simply put one foot in front of the other on the road to Anchorage, and he thought that perhaps wisdom and necessity, when a man has nothing else, are not so very different from each other after all. Chapter 6. In the 7th week they crossed a line on Reyes's salvage charts that Voss did not fully understand the significance of until she explained it to him over the chart table, tracing it with one chapped finger. The old equator, the line that had once divided a world into hemispheres of opposite season, and that now, in the new geography the cold had drawn, divided something else, a hemisphere succumbing to the wolf's patient hunger from one that had not yet, perhaps would never, feel its teeth. The change did not come all at once, the way the old stories of southern paradises might have promised. It came the way all true changes in that decade had come, by degrees so small a man might doubt his own senses, until the cumulative evidence overwhelmed the doubt. The ice on the wave crests grew thinner, then stopped forming at all. The wind, which had carried a particular knife-edge quality for so many years that Voss had forgotten wind could feel any other way, softened by degrees into something merely cold instead of murderous. And then, on a morning in the 8th week, a morning that began like every other gray and grinding morning of the voyage, Eli came pounding down the companionway to the engine room with a wildness in his face that made Voss's heart seize, certain for one terrible instant that some new disaster had found them. "Come up," the boy said, breathless. "Come up and look." What there was to see, when Voss climbed to the deck with his heart still hammering from the false alarm of the boy's urgency, was the sun. Not the small hard coin of light that had governed the sky over Anchorage for 11 years. A sun that gave illumination without conviction, like a lamp left burning in an empty house. This was a sun with weight to it, a sun that struck the deck plates and warmed them, faintly but unmistakably, beneath Voss's gloved hand. A sun that had, somewhere in the long gray weeks of the voyage, begun to mean something again. He stood at the rail with Eli beside him and the whole gaunt company of the last argument gathering by ones and twos around them, drawn up from below by some wordless signal that passed through the ship's worn timbers faster than any spoken news could have traveled, and he watched the light lie golden and entirely sufficient across water that had, at last, stopped trying to freeze. Nobody cheered. Voss would remember that detail for the rest of his life. How the moment that should have called for cheering instead produced only a vast collective silence. 41 survivors standing at the rail with their faces turned up like flowers no one had told them they were still capable of being. And tears on more than one weathered face that had not, Voss suspected, allowed itself tears in a very long time, not for grief and not for this stranger feeling, which did not yet have a name because it had been so long absent from the catalogue of feelings any of them still trusted themselves to have. Henriksen broke the silence first, in the end, with the dry, understated humor of a man who had spent a life on cold water and had earned the right to a joke at the universe's expense. "Well," he said, "I suppose we'll be wanting lighter coats." It was not much of a joke, but it cracked something open in the gathered company, and the silence gave way to a sound that was half laughter and half something rawer and harder to name, and Voss found Eli's hand gripping his own sleeve with a fierceness that startled him, and looked down to find the boy crying without any shame at all, openly, the way only the very young or the very old allow themselves to cry, and Voss did not tell him to stop. Chapter 7. They made landfall 11 days later on a coast that Reyes's charts called Tasmania, though the charts were 11 years out of date, and Voss understood, watching the green hills rise out of a sea gone properly, ordinarily blue, that every map any of them carried was now a kind of fiction, a document describing a world that no longer entirely existed, useful only as a rough gesture toward where the rivers had once run and the cities had once stood. What mattered was not the name on the chart. What mattered was the green. He had forgotten in 11 years the particular shock of green, not the captive green of a hydroponic bay kept alive on ration power, which Anchorage Station had maintained in a single greenhouse module with the same grim discipline it gave its fuel reserves, but green that simply was, that asked permission of no one, that covered hillsides in a profusion so casual it seemed almost an insult to the discipline the northern survivors had learned to apply to every resource, every calorie, every degree of stored heat. He stood at the rail as the last argument nosed into a harbor crowded, astonishingly, gloriously crowded, with other vessels, other refugees from other frozen ports, flying flags Voss did not recognize and some he did, the gathered diaspora of a hemisphere's worth of people who had each made, in their own desperate hour, the same calculation Reyes had made on the chart table back in Anchorage, and who had each, in their own last arguments, made the same long cold voyage toward the same stubborn green hope. There would be hard winters ahead. Even here, Voss understood this with the clear, unsentimental vision the last 11 years had trained into him. A hemisphere's worth of desperate arrivals did not simply solve itself into easy plenty. There would be rationing here too, and arguments over land and food and the thousand small frictions of strangers learning to share a shrunken world, and somewhere, certainly, the cold itself would continue its patient southward crawl, slower perhaps in this hemisphere, perhaps stalled by oceans the conveyor belt's collapse had not yet starved, but not stopped, never stopped, because the wolf that had woken did not sleep again merely because men had found, for a time, a clearing it had not yet reached. But that was a problem for tomorrow's watch, and Voss had learned, on the long voyage, to hold only the pump in front of him and trust that the ocean would still be there to think about once the pump was running. He stood at the rail with Eli and Henriksen and Reyes, who had brought them this far on a ship she had rebuilt with her own exhausted hands, and Ida, whose grandmother's old patient wisdom about the breadth of the world had, in the end, proved truer than any of the satellite models the old world had trusted so completely, and he watched the green hills come up to meet them in the ordinary, unhurried, entirely sufficient light of an afternoon sun, and he thought of Father Doyle standing his lonely watch in the white north, keeping faith with a frequency that might, for all Voss knew, never again carry a voice worth hearing, and he thought that a man could carry two truths in him at once without their canceling each other out, that the cold was real and patient and would not be defeated, only outrun and outlived and reckoned with again and again, season upon season, for as long as the wolf remained hungry, and that also here now, in this particular hour, the sun was warm on the deck plates, and the boy beside him was crying for reasons that had nothing to do with grief, and the green hills did not care what century of foolishness had brought their visitors to this shore, only that the shore, this once, this time, was wide enough and warm enough to hold them. "What do we do now?" Eli asked, and there was no fear left in the question at all, only the plain practical curiosity of a boy who had learned, across one hard winter ocean, that the question always had an answer, even if the answer was only the next necessary thing. Voss looked at the harbor crowded with strangers who had each survived their own cold, and at the green hills waiting beyond it, patient and indifferent and entirely alive, and felt the old engineer's habit settle over him like a familiar coat. "Now," he said, "we find out what needs fixing first." It was not a grand answer. It was not the answer of the old stories, the ones that ended with triumph trumpeted from a mountaintop. But Voss had buried a wife and a daughter under northern snow, and walked 40 miles alone with nothing but tools on a sled, and crossed an ocean that had tried, in 100 small patient ways, to keep them all, and he had learned, in the learning of all of it, that the only honest answer left to a man who has survived the wolf is to turn, without ceremony, and begin the work of the next morning, and that this, in the end, undramatic and unglamorous and entirely sufficient, was what it had always meant, in every age before this one and every age still to come, to be among the living.